Welcome to the panel, Global Consumer Attitudes about Online Learning. I'm Michael Horn, really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today with our esteemed panelists to help us break down and understand how attitudes around online learning have changed since the pandemic, and online learning has been thrust on center stage and off the headlines, if you will, of education trade publications into mainstream stories and mainstream publications and news outlets. And so with us to break this down, first we have Stephanie Marken, the Executive Director of Education Research at Gallup. We have Andy Rosen, Chairman and CEO at Kaplan. Laura Howe, the Vice President for Innovation Communications at Pearson. And then Mike Silagadze, the founder and CEO of Top Hat. And I think this is going to be a great conversation because you all have a lot of experience and opinions with this, but I'll start with Stephanie, and then Andy and Laura. I'd love to have you pile in on this particular question. Just, Stephanie, obviously at Gallup, you are constantly looking at this question of attitudes around online learning. I'd love you to give us the state of play on online learning, both in the US, obviously, and then as the rest of the panel jumps in, globally as well, since the pandemic has hit. And in particular, how that's changed. Like, what's the movement and the delta from before the pandemic to after?
Yeah, also I'll start with just the general public, because we've actually been asking the general public how they view online education since 2013 at Gallup. So when it was becoming mainstream, we started asking individuals how they would compare online learning, hybrid, and then in-person models in terms of the value they provide consumers, the ability to flex curriculum, the diversity of the offerings provided, et cetera. And when we first started asking individuals about this throughout the US, what we found is there were a few places where they thought online education actually did a much better job, and value is absolutely one of those places. So when we ask US adults the extent to which they think online education does a better, the same, or a worse job on value, they actually report thinking it does a best job on value. And I think that's really interesting. I think there are also implications for how institutions are pricing online programs right now, keeping that in mind, because a lot of people just assume that online also means less expensive, and that's obviously not always the case. So I think that's a really important consumer perspective to kind of account for in how we market and describe programs to consumers. But overwhelmingly, they think that they're high value opportunities. Now, in terms of how that's been affected by the pandemic, we actually see that's endured a little bit. And I'm referencing Strata Education Network data that a lot of people tuning in today might have seen. They started interviewing during the pandemic about online education. What they found is when they asked individuals, what's the best value, in-person, hybrid, or online, they actually found equal percentages of the US adult population saying each of those was the best value for their money. So I think value is a really important part of the conversation from the consumer point of view in terms of how they think about online education. Having said that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what happened in the spring has probably impacted a lot of consumers' views of online education, because we know the rush to get online in the spring was not exactly what we would call high quality online education. It was putting a lot of people into a Zoom invite like we are here today and assuming, curriculum is delivered equally. It's definitely not what we would probably describe as high quality, digitally designed online education. A lot of people who struggled through that in the spring, I think incorrectly assume that's what online education looks like. Now, I was looking at a verbatim response from an individual who participated in a survey in the spring, and she said something to the tune of, looks like we're going to be in the fall. If that's the case, then I'm out at this current price point. This is not the high quality online education that I should be receiving for the price that I'm paying. So this piece of price, I think, has a huge impact on how people think about not just the quality that they experience, but whether or not online education is for them. So I'll pause there because I have other things to share too, but would love other people's reactions to some of that.
Well, I can pick up from here. I think a lot of people, the question that most people are sort of thinking about when they think about this issue is, what did it mean when 20 million students, most of whom had every intention of going to school face-to-face, suddenly went online, right? And I think the sort of assumptions fall into one of two categories, right? One is that, hey, all these people have now been exposed to online. They're gonna, now that they've seen it, they're gonna be interested in it. And the other is what Stephanie just said, which is they got exposed to it and they didn't like what they saw, and therefore we're gonna push people away. And that's a really, like, the math would say that, not the math of a particular poll, because I haven't really seen a lot that takes us through the pandemic. The math would say more people being exposed is going to bring more people into the market, because the people who pushed back, who didn't like what they saw, probably were not enthusiastic about the idea in general. But all that aside, I actually think maybe the more interesting question is, what's the impact on the 300 million plus people in the United States who were not in higher education at the time? Because I think for those people, it's a different world. Why? Because the most important brands in education have now given full-throated endorsement to online. And did they do that by saying online is great, we love online? No, they did it with actually a more powerful message, which is to say, we here at Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford or UCLA or Georgetown, whatever, we view this online education to be Harvard quality. And we're going to treat it as though it is just like all other Harvard education. When you get these global, most admired brands saying that online education is the functional equivalent of the carefully manicured, nurtured education on campus, that is a huge statement. And by the way, they went further than just that. They effectively said, it's not just acceptable, it is equal to what happens on campus. And why do I say that? Because they charge the same price. They didn't say, well, look, let's face it, it's not the same. It's 20, 30%, charge less expensive because it's not the same. They didn't do that. And remember, we're talking about the perception of the consumer. The consumer thinks of these educational brands as do-gooders, right? They have plenty of money. They would do whatever is the right thing to do. And when they charge the same price for online as they do for face-to-face, they are saying it is possible to have an elite education online. Now, how that plays out over the course of the next year, 10 years, we're going to have to see. But, and maybe we'll talk about it later, there is, if you look at the history of online education, it is the first opposition and then the grudging acceptance of elite universities that has been a bit of a barrier. Once that is released, I think that online education is going to be just far more accepted today and in the next year than it was 6 or 8 months ago. And I'll stop there, and maybe we can talk about global issues later.
Well, just to build on, Andy, what you're saying, I think what we're seeing from our point of view is a fairly broad acceptance and a growing acceptance of online learning. And Pearson has started running a global education survey every year. So it's called the Global Learners Survey, and it's a worldwide global survey. We looked at learners, about 7,000 learners in 7 countries this year alone, and what we're seeing is that about 3/4 of learners say that COVID has fundamentally changed learning forever. And I think that's interesting because the big driver behind that was indeed online learning. And so even last year when we asked about online learning and do you see it being a part of education moving forward, about 3/4 of people said, yeah, more people at the K-12 level and at the higher ed level are going to be learning online in the next 10 years. So I think there's broad acceptance. And when we started to actually ask specifically this year, do you think that education coming out of COVID will be a more permanent part of education? Pretty clearly worldwide, about 80 to 90% of people across the globe in different countries said that yes, it's going to be a part of education moving forward, and a permanent part. Now, is that full-time online? Is that pieces of online coming into education? I don't think we know yet, but I think what people are seeing is that technology, digital use, online content consumption around the board is a part of their life. And now they're seeing that as a part of education moving forward. So I think coming out of COVID, what we're seeing is really a viewpoint that education now has an online component to some degree, And that online component, whatever that is and whatever form that takes for people, is really going to be here to stay and kind of stick around.
It's fascinating to hear you all reflect on that. Mike, I'd love to turn to you, and because you were actively supporting the creation of active learning environments. Didn't mean to use the word twice, but and so I'm curious, from your perspective, supporting partners and standing up instructional experiences, what's behind the shift in sentiment that we've been hearing, and what else are you seeing on the ground as you work with partners around sort of what's raising their hackles or flags that they're seeing that are exciting them or discouraging them during this shift?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been fascinating. I mean, we're kind of in a unique position in that we had a front row seat to the transition right at the faculty and the student level that happened in the spring semester, and now we've been working with hundreds of institutions to help them make that transition to online. One of the ways that we work with institutions is running a variety of webinars and faculty workshops and getting people comfortable with active learning, because where prior to that, faculty members could very much, stay with a very traditional model with print textbooks, with traditional sage on the stage sort of style of delivery. That option, with the as a result of COVID and the shift to online, really went away. And so institutions were, did a valiant job, I would say, training up their faculty, providing them with tools, doing whatever they could in order to get them up to speed on some sort of active learning pedagogy, technology implementation to create, a positive experience. And, to be perfectly frank, the results have been mixed. We've seen probably a third of institutions produce a really high quality online experience that in many ways, I would actually say, in many ways exceeds what was actually possible in a traditional environment. And that's exciting. And I actually think that points to the future in that online will absolutely play a much larger role than it did previously. I don't think we're going back to what we had before. But at the same time, we do see institutions, probably about sort of the bottom third. Some of these are high, well-ranked institutions that pretty much handed faculty members a Zoom license and said good luck, and showed them how to use the LMS, how to turn on their webcam. And it's disastrous, and it's not good. I mean, we're seeing lots of faculty, lots of students really struggling with that. And I don't know on balance where things end up. I don't know whether it's going to end up with more positive attitudes as a result of this, or more negative attitudes, or mixed, depending on which institution or community you're a part of. But it's been fascinating to watch. And we, like everybody else on this panel, have been doing whatever we could to help.
One thing I'll add around the quality piece, because I think that's important to understanding like the state of online education. We conducted a study last year with 2U where we interviewed graduates who had participated in a 2U powered program across a series of institutions. And what we found was the vast majority of them reported that they had at least one professor who made them actually excited about learning. And they did a rate that was much higher than the national average, which included both in-person and online programs. And I think it's a helpful reminder that you can create an engaging experience without being in person. In person is part of it for some people based on their talent profile and how they like to instruct, but it's not required to create really an engaging experience for students. And what I heard a lot about in the spring in terms of complaints was, my professors never desired to teach in this format. They don't have the talent, the skills, or the real passion for it. And so I think that might mean also we have a little bit of a shift in who is teaching where. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think it's important that faculty be selected for the right format. Not everybody is as amazing online as they are in person. And that, I think that's okay. But I do think that schools are going to have to be really, I think, very aware of where those professors are soaring with their strengths and where they're potentially in the wrong format, because not every format is for every professor.
Yeah, I think for institutions, you're going to have, every institution is going to have to treat online as a first-class citizen. I think you have a lot of schools that treat it as sort of a sideshow, and that clearly doesn't work. Like now it needs to be a core competency for institutions to deliver a high-quality online experience, because it's not going to be, the way it was before. Even the small liberal arts colleges that I think in some ways have been hit hardest by this change are going to have to figure out how to create a really amazing, engaging experience like they traditionally have had in an online format.
Yeah, I think it is. It's easy and it's sort of classic to be highly critical of our higher education system and our universities and say a lot of these classes were not very engaging and they didn't really use online as well as they could have. I actually think the more interesting point is that it is remarkable how quickly our universities changed. I mean, it is if there's one topic, one truism really of the ASU GSV conference over the years, it's that universities are slow moving. They don't do anything until they're pushed into it, right? I mean, and yet over the course of a week, every university in the country, and of course, really truly around the world, suddenly became an online institution in some fashion. So if you had said at last year's ASU GSV that there will come a time when every university delivers every class online, where every professor is teaching online, what year do you think that will be? I would put the over-under at something like 2035 or something like that. And yet, the university system made this change. They didn't collapse, right? They didn't fall apart altogether. Again, it is very easy and probably appropriate to be critical about whether it was as good as it could have been. But compared to what I think the expectations of people in this environment would have had about the university system, I think it was one of the finest hours of the American higher ed system.
So I want to jump off from there, Andy, and ask a next question. And Laura, you may have perspective of this from Pearson seeing globally across, but which is, you said, higher ed won't do it unless pushed. They were clearly pushed, right? And so I guess I'm curious, as we see the range of they did it, and I think you're right, that's a credit. I'm curious what we're seeing right now in the fall in terms of how much that experience has improved from spring to fall and what you all are seeing on that and how that's getting reflected in sentiment, both at the faculty level and the student level around that, because that maybe starts to give us indications of what will last beyond sort of however long this pandemic moment lasts. Laura, I turn to you maybe on that for perspective, and then love to hear everyone jump in.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing is that, people are, I think, trying to do a better job and trying to do a more fulsome job than what they did in the spring. I think that there's sort of a wide recognition, as Stephanie said, that the spring wasn't exactly the best example of this, and that if we are going to do this continually, right, there is a need to build skills among faculty. There's a need to find the right faculty to sort of join up. I know from faculty that I know, a lot of them frankly have embraced it, both because they did find the value in the online teaching, but also frankly a lot of them were concerned about being in a classroom, and I think that has been a widely sort of debated topic. How do you bring people back to campus, and do you? And so I think there's been an embrace of it, and we're seeing an embrace of it, both from a very utilitarian standpoint of this is the right thing to do, the healthy thing to do for people, but also because they want to. So I think we're seeing more people even embracing digital products if they haven't done that before, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity here to be able to kind of look across the landscape and figure out where the opportunities are. And I think one of the things that's interesting in some of the research that we do is you've got people, I think, who were calling for more of these online courses and online classes. And it's not just the traditional end-to-end sort of semester class. There is a lot of, I think, appetite out there among higher ed consumers, both for sort of the traditional courses and the degree programs, but also for shorter courses as well. And I think that also from the online space is something where there's a whole lot of opportunity that people aren't really thinking about. And I think what you're starting to see is an embrace of looking at that model as well.
Yeah, Michael, my sense is that as there are so many things, there was a bit of separation among universities, among those who handled the fall one way and those who handled it another. And what I mean by that, I felt like there was a lot of schools that were trying as hard as they could to preserve their face-to-face campus environment, and they got buckets of disinfectant, and they tried to get football back, and all these things to try to make the campus experience feel as much as it could like it did before. And then there are other universities, and I think that since it's right here on our slide, ASU would be probably an example of it, that I felt invested in the future. That is, ASU really invested in making sure that there was equipment, technology in the classroom that would enable students to either come to the classroom or be at home. They basically, ASU, you can see, is moving down a path in which a student can come to class one day and go online another day, or go watch a video the next, like making it almost like campus is a place you can go but not a place you have to go, and you don't have to choose one versus another. So if you have a family wedding you want to go and stay in school. If you even want to go on vacation, or you have a business meeting or something, you can continue with your education. And I felt like ASU is an example of a number of schools that really used this crisis as an opportunity to build the institution of the future, which toggles back and forth among these various modalities, ultimately making it something you don't even think about. You don't really think about whether you are an online banker, or a face-to-face bank. If you need to deposit a check and you can do it, from your app, you do it. If you need to go in and talk to somebody, you do it. Like, most people don't think of ourselves in that way, and I think that they're moving at a place where you can see that education will feel the same way. And others could have done that, but chose to invest elsewhere.
And I also, to your point, Andy, like, we're headed towards massive employment disruption. And traditionally, of course, that's great for higher ed because people are going to return to higher education to upskill, to reskill, to change careers, et cetera. But that movement is not going to come from people that want to necessarily be butts in seats and in person. So over the course of the next 5 years, those who are returning are going to be looking, obviously, for an online option. And even if we were just studying the data, we'd be remiss if we didn't notice that the fastest growing universities in the country are online, right? So even if we looked at the last 5 years of data, that's clearly the trend. So even pre-COVID, you'd have to acknowledge that's probably the way of the future. And I really hate to say this out loud, but this is probably not our last pandemic. It's probably not the last time students won't be able to come and be in person. So I do fear a little bit for the schools that have held on so tightly to their goalposts on the football field that this is going to be a really challenging, next 10 years, because there will be potentially another health crisis, or, to Andy's point, people have family obligations. They just can't participate in person in the same way. And how many students are we leaving out because of that? So I think we'd be remiss not to try to get ahead rather than kind of holding on tight. I personally don't want to go backwards. I have no interest. I think people keep talking about, like, when will we get back to normal? Like, God, I hope we don't, because we left so many students out when we were back in normal, right? It's not a system that's necessarily served us perfectly. So, bring on the innovation and the disruption.
Michael, I wonder if I could just mention one thing. Our conversation here has been very U.S. centric. In some ways, I think the change has been even more dramatic outside the U.S. because for all the issues of are we embracing online, and are we resistant online? The U.S. has embraced online more than any other country in the world. Maybe people would argue Korea is a competitor on that, but really. We operate around the world. We have, hundreds of thousands of students outside the United States who we're dealing with all the time. And it's been hard to get people to go to school online. But we're finding in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in Australia, New Zealand, students are much more excited about it and open to going online. So In Singapore, for example, we have 15,000 students who are pursuing higher education with partner institutions of ours on our campus there. And all of that was face-to-face because in Singapore, people weren't really that interested in online. And it's a small country, so everybody can get to one of our campuses and so on. Well, obviously, we had to shift, and our surveys of students say that, first of all, 87% of them say we're really happy with with our education. We're not chafing at this. I mean, I think that's a reflection of a well-designed program, but it also is the case that almost the same percentage said, I don't want all face-to-face when I come back. I want either hybrid, or a surprisingly large percentage of students said, I just want to keep on going online. Because even though, it's a small country and it's only, half an hour basically from anywhere in the island, they don't want to travel that half an hour and park and all that. So I think we're really seeing a pretty big shift, and you have the same impact that I talked about before, where all those great universities that exist outside the United States similarly are endorsing. And again, when I say endorsing, I'm not saying that they are sent out a press release. I'm saying by their actions, it is perceived by everyone that they have put their stamp of approval on online education. So the combination, I think, is in the U.S. it's been a pretty steady trend towards more adoption of online. It's been much slower outside the U.S., and I think that we're going to see a much faster pickup.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, and just to bring in, since you mentioned Korea also, it's been an interesting point that they've adopted online very aggressively outside of the education system, but even in the formal system. I was doing webinars in Korea, or virtually for Korea after this all hit. And all of them were talking about the restrictions of the number of class hours that were allowed to be online and how they were having to change all the rules and the implication of that for societies that were very calcified in the traditional way of delivering. And so I guess that actually shifts me to the question I want to ask you, Mike, and we'll be rapid on this because we're starting to get questions come in and I want to make sure we get through some of them. But Mike, starting with you, I'm curious if you're seeing differences of how different institutions, different types of institutions have responded to that, and therefore what the difference in attitude around online learning might be by different segments of the population, US, internationally, however you want to take that, or is it too hard to generalize along those characteristics of community colleges versus 4 years, or bachelor's program versus master's, things like that? Can we draw any lessons around that?
I think that's a really great question, and there absolutely have been differences among categories of institutions. For Top Hat, we've got a couple million students on our platform, tens of thousands of faculty members, and most of our usage tends to concentrate in large 4-year publics and then smaller 4 years. But we have enough usage in community colleges in the UK, Australia, internationally, to kind of get a feel for it. And there's absolutely been a huge difference. It does seem like the larger institutions have had the hardest time to make the transition. The ones that had not already embraced and had a vibrant online program prior to that, because they just had a much heavier burden, frankly. They had a lot more faculty members, a lot more courses to be able to move online, a lot more students. Whereas smaller institutions, maybe smaller 4 years, and the liberal arts colleges have had a much more nimble response. It's interesting that the comment was made that many institutions, worked really hard to preserve their on-campus experience, and that's absolutely true. We have seen schools working really hard, I think rationally, so to try and preserve that experience. And I think that is actually the right thing to do, because when you remove the on-campus experience from a lot of institutions, what really happens is the differentiation that they had really goes away. I mean, to a student then, going to, the Ohio State University versus Indiana versus, whatever school, kind of goes away, because you're basically getting the same experience. And then the only thing that really starts mattering is price. And schools don't want that. I mean, that is absolutely something that they want to avoid. And I actually think that the future is going to be such that that on-campus experience is going to be a core component of institutions, of the value they offer in higher education. But a lot of the educational delivery model is going to shift to be much more heavily online. I think hybrid is going to become effectively the default. I actually, from what we've seen, high flex has gone really badly pretty much across the board. Most faculty members that we have that tried high flex very quickly moved to 100% online. So I don't know, maybe there's a way to get it right, but we haven't seen that work too well through our platform. So that's kind of where we see things moving.
I'm going to call on someone. Laura, and then let's quickly go around. Just any observations by institution characteristics or responses to Mike, because we might have gotten a little disagreement there in the panel, which is always a good thing around preserving versus innovating. So yeah, Laura.
Well, yeah, so I'm not so sure it's much about the type of university, right? And which kind of university, responded and reacted to online better. I actually think it's about what consumers are demanding from universities and will be demanding.
Right.
So one of the things
Yep.
that we asked in our Global Learners Survey this year is we asked learners what they think about how educational institutions use technology and if they use technology as well as other sectors of the economy. And 2/3 of people told us that they think that educational institutions are well behind institutions like banking, healthcare in the use of technology. And I think what that tells us is that institutions better listen to consumers and get ready, because people use online services, they use technology in basically every other part of their lives. They consume content digitally now. And I think, regardless of the size of the institution or how the institution is using it, consumers now expect institutions to have online as some part of their offering, and whether that is in courseware and that being digital, or whether that's in the actual degree program offering that an institution has. To me, it's not really a question of how are institutions implementing or which ones are implementing better. It's really a question of all the institutions that are out there and all the kinds, what are students coming to expect from them? So I would actually kind of flip the question a little bit, because to me, this is really all about, now consumers are going to come knocking on your door expecting you to be highly digital and highly online, like everything else they experience in their lives.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I mean, 100%. What we've heard time and time again in talking to institutions is a lot of what they did was very much in response to what they heard from students. So students, it's not that schools, felt particularly strongly, I guess, that they wanted to reopen the campus, for example. They heard that from their students. Students wanted to come back. And I couldn't agree more with Laura that the students are going to be demanding an online option. They're going to expect that any course that they want to take is available online as well as in a traditional synchronous environment, then schools are going to be expected to get it right. And they're going to expect their partners, whatever partners they work with, to help them support both modalities.
So on the question of vendors, we're getting a ton of questions that just came in. So we've got about 10 minutes. So I want to try to get through a bunch of them if we can. There's a question of what are the differences in attitudes and degree of changing teaching methods by instructor type. So are adjuncts or tenure track instructors more or less likely to invest the time and effort to modify their craft, and how do the incentives play with that? Mike, my guess is you or Andy has the closest read on that one, but if others do, we can give quick answers on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. What we've seen is one of the things that's consistently, that we've heard consistently from faculty members is that doing the course properly online, and when I say properly, with sufficient prep, with lots of pre-recorded materials available, and all the communications and content set up, that takes a ton of work. I mean, it is a huge amount of work for a faculty member, and most schools, most institutions didn't have the support infrastructure to be able to enable their faculty to a sufficient degree to move everything online, and hence you have these different a very sort of wide tapestry of different levels of quality across institutions or even within institutions. So it's just a huge amount of work to do it properly. and you're seeing, tenure track faculty. So my wife actually is a tenure track faculty member at University of Rochester. I see it firsthand. I mean, she has to invest a huge amount of effort to be able to, to create a really good online experience. And that frankly comes at the expense of doing research. And so tenure track faculty, I think, are particularly hard hit. Those that have taught their course in the same way for decades now are also particularly hard hit. In some ways, adjuncts, to the extent they have more flexibility, I think have a bit more time to be able to put in the energy. But even there, they're being asked to teach larger classes, more students, and more classes, and so that I don't think anybody's in a particularly great spot.
So another question coming in is, will we see increasing numbers of international students opting for online or local options instead of coming to the US? Laura and Andy, I'm guessing you all have perspective on that. So I'll start there, and then if others want to jump in, of course.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, I think it largely depends on what happens with travel and the availability of that, and also frankly what happens from a visa standpoint in the US. I think what online does give people the option is that it is, it makes it more convenient, and it makes it a lot easier to access an American education if you are overseas. And so I think there will be an appetite for that. I think the jury is frankly still out. And I think when we asked people sort of how do you see this unfolding, when we specifically in our survey asked if you think that the number of people traveling to the US will be down, and about 2/3 of people said, yeah, that's going to start to taper off. I mean, I have hope that will rebound actually, and that the desire to sort of have a cross-cultural experience will sort of prevail over that. But I think the jury is definitely out on that question. Although I think there's some definite pessimism out there about whether or not students will return, even if they have the option to do so.
Yeah, I would say for many international students, they travel to the other countries with an experiential goal, every bit as much as a learning goal. That is, they want to live in London or Boston or Sydney, and get to make some new friends and build relationships and learn the language and become part of something so they can go back. And I think that market is going to come back. I think there will be a vastly expanded market of students who don't have the time, don't have the money to pursue an education in place over a period of several years, but want the great brands of American education or British education, Australian, German, and they're going to do it from home, and they're going to do it online. And I think there's going to be, much more openness to it. And I would just say on this, we had when the crisis hit, we had tens of thousands of international students, overseas in America or Britain or Australia, and almost all of them stayed put and continued their education online, and are continuing to do so in the fall. But I think if we said you're never going to get a chance to go back to that school, they would say, all right, well, time to go home. But they are willing to wait. And again, I think our surveys say they're pretty happy with the experience. I mean, they'd rather go to parties and to meet more people like everyone else would. But I think there's just a very much an increased openness globally. But the market is going to expand.
So I think you're all sort of answering a variation of this, but I'll just ask it because just to make sure we get it in there. It's a good question, and Stephanie, I'd love to start with you on this, which is sort of the big question this person poses is when students have the option between a 30-person in-class experience and a 30-person online experience, do you expect them to switch in large numbers to online post-COVID? Where do you come down on that?
I actually don't think traditional age students who've long sought an in-person experience will switch in long numbers to an online experience if given the option. And Mike alluded to this, right? These schools are in person because they got a lot of pressure to do so. I think over time we will see a small group, kind of if you think about a Venn diagram, those who can only do online, those who can and want to do in person. There is a small group, I think, in the middle that could go either way. And I think we could capture them more effectively if online was a real option that was available in the market, and not just by one school, but by many schools who have different curriculum offerings. I will say the one thing that I think we still have to explain to consumers is that online does not mean less rigorous. So in our research, what we find is people who've never experienced an online educational program think it means less rigor. And I hear this a lot from schools who say, we're fully online. All of these students came here enrolling thinking it was going to be much easier than an in-person experience. Online does not mean easy. And so I do think as people are exposed to it, they'll understand that a little bit more effectively. Even employers, we did a study 2 years ago, we found employers who had actually experienced an online education themselves were really positive about hiring somebody who had an online education. And I think that's because they knew what it looked like from the inside. So a little more education, I think, to do there.
Michael, if I could just add one thing to that. Traditional universities have always felt like, they've got an ace in the hole. Students are not going to go online because, 18 to 24-year-olds want to be around each other. They want to have that fun experience. What happened so quickly in the pandemic is students said, you know what, let's get an apartment in Park City and all, have an environment with a bunch of young people, and then we'll go to our school online. And there are a couple of people who are starting to build, or think about building dorms for students, potentially for multiple institutions. So universities may not have a monopoly on that socialization element. Students may be able to go online, locate themselves in a place where they can ski or scuba dive or learn French or whatever they want, and yet still go to school online. So like there actually are alternatives to that campus environment that emerged with incredible speed in this pandemic, I thought. And it sort of tells you a little bit about what might happen in the times to come.
That's a really good point, because it also, there's a couple questions coming in about K-12, and I'm just going to apologize to those asking it that we're focusing mostly on higher ed in this conversation by design. But I will say it's interesting because in the same way we've seen sort of the micro school or pod phenomenon grow right in K-12, you're seeing that mirror, to your point, Andy, in higher ed of a bunch of people, but the students themselves being able to self-organize to create these different aspects of the college experience, but then go online. And so last question as we wrap up, and Mike, I'll go to you on this one, which is there's a curiosity about how you feel that accessibility has turned out this fall, that in the rush to go online in the spring, it wasn't always accessible. So 30-second answer on access, and particularly for those with special needs around learning.
Yeah, I would say it's been interesting. I mean, we've certainly invested a lot more. So as of March, when it was very clear that where things were trending, Top Hat actually ended up investing a tremendous amount of engineering effort to make sure that for to the extent that we do video, closed captioning, and slides and HTML5, and all of that was set up so that